Raz, dwa, trzy. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope your coffee worked well for the next 2 hours on stage. Please proceed to your seats and we'll start session 2 or 3. Raz, dwa, trzy. Do you mind if you start when they are still entering the room or just wait for them? Yeah, okay, no worries. We kindly ask you to come back to your seats. We're going to start in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you enjoyed your short coffee break. So we are ready for session 2 and 3, which will run one by one. And after the session 3, the lunch will follow. So we soon have been able to refresh yourself. And on stage already, we have our session 2 panelists as well as the moderator, Mr. Lanan Abrahamson. Sorry. In preparing for this prestigious host here, I have read a lot of biographies of the panelists and speakers. So I find out that Mr. Abrahamson has been reporting on sport and anti-doping for quite a while already, for a very long time. And I know he's really excited to be moderating 2 very interesting sessions. So please give a warm welcome to the panelists, and I give the microphone to Mr. Alan.
Morning, everybody. Working? Morning, everybody. I believe if this session is going to start the way it's supposed to start, we have a video to start with. So if I could ask the video to start, please.
You had 206 countries, 206 National Olympic Committees, 35 or 40 Olympic sports, all with different rules or no rules in anti-doping, and saying, you know, what we have to do is collect all of these rules and make them the same for every athlete, every country, every sport.
WADA is the World Anti-Doping Agency. We are here to fight for clean sport. We're here to fight for the rights of clean athletes, and we're here to protect the values of sports in the whole world.
The organization that has established itself over the past 20 years almost as the place to go for matters involving anti-doping. It wasn't like that all the time.
The early days? Yeah, well, WADA only in existence for about 20 years, almost 20 years. Started as a small idea, a small concept, also a small problem, because it was problems that created the need for an agency such as WADA.
Big problem that affected the integrity of sport, the economics of sport, the reason that you want your kids to participate in sport.
And we worked quite hard to keep focus on what we were going to do with the doping problems that clearly existed.
It was one thing to say that we don't like this. It was another thing to say, how do we stop it?
It really was the impact of the so-called Festina scandal in the Tour de France in 1998, and the realization of what was going on caused everyone to say, you know, you really can't trust cycling or any other sport to really police its athletes. You can't rely on governments of particular countries to make sure their athletes are clean. What we need is an independent international agency that is not controlled by any particular stakeholder.
1999 in February in Lausanne, the World Conference on Doping in Sport, organized by the IOC.
Many discussions took place about the role of a possible new agency and the system of decision, the governance, the financial contributions.
And this all led up to the point, November 99, when WADA was founded.
Public authorities and the sports side has a conversation, and they have decided to make a hybrid organization.
And WADA came as a proposal to joint effort between sports and governments.
Around the table for decision-making in WADA, you have the representatives of the government, but on the other side also the representative of the sport movement on an equal basis.
It was the first time that an agency was actually made up of 50% sport and 50% public authorities or governments. So for us that was a significant challenge to get the public authorities to trust sport in handling doping matters, and for the sports movement to allow the governments of the world into their realm.
Dick Pound was, in my view, the perfect man at the perfect time. Having Dick Pound at the beginning of WADA's existence really allowed the agency to be put on the map.
Richard Pound I think was a real pioneer. I mean, he had to dig the trenches and to move things forward.
As a president, he extolled all the virtues of WADA, particularly transparency and independence.
And he managed to, get rule harmonized across all sports and all governments. I don't think people realize the achievement of that. It was really a very important groundwork that had to be done.
Anyway, it took me 9 years to get out of it instead of 2, and I'm still on the foundation board.
John Fahey came after Richard. He too was an outstanding man, had very strong values.
He was a minister from Australia.
I was a representative of the governments of the world. WADA is a partnership between sport and 196 governments of the world. I was the nominee of those governments for the term that I occupied.
He was a statesman, he was a politician.
John Fahey managed to do a lot of consolidation, make sure that the organization was still striving in the right direction.
It's in John's era that WADA developed a lot of partnership, in particular partnerships with the pharmaceutical industry, partnerships with Interpol and law enforcement, and everything that has to do with intelligence collection, intelligence gathering, and investigations.
Then came the last and current president, Craig Reedy.
Craig knew us very well because he has been, since the inception of WADA, an executive committee and foundation board member. He was our treasurer, he was the chair of our finance committee. And Craig came with a sensitivity from the sports movement, but a good knowledge also of the governments.
As president of WADA, you have an overarching role. I chair the board, I chair the executive committee. I'm involved in most of the routine things that go on. It's interesting, and I lead a very considerable team of high-quality people.
Credit needs to be given to Craig for steering WADA during a time where things were really challenging and difficult.
And he had to find a solution to move things forward, to keep the organization on track, despite a lot of attack on the organization, to ensure that justice would be done, both for the athletes, but also to ensure that the process by which we were dealing with Russia would be followed and work, allowing for a fair resolution of the entire crisis.
Having somebody like Craig at the helm of WADA, I think Craig is a very astute politician and strategist. I think that he managed to bring WADA through that crisis very brilliantly without necessarily being given the credit, but I think that history will prove him right. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment will bring WADA to what it should be, which is really a strong watchdog of the global fight against doping in sport. At the beginning of 2020, we will have at the top positions of WADA, the vice presidency and the presidency, two recent former athletes, Witold Bańka, who currently is the sports minister in Poland, and Yang Yang, who's a former short track speed skater from China. And so having these two persons at the helm of an agency which really fights for the rights of the athletes and the protection of athletes' dreams is fantastic.
My name is Witold Bańka, the Minister of Sport and Tourism from Poland and the next WADA president. Eradicate doping, eradicate the cheats from sports environment. This is our common mission. That's why I proposed establishing Anti-Doping Solidarity Fund. Well-developed countries should help these less developed countries lead anti-doping policy conduct and improve the system. The second very important issue is that, from my opinion, we should increase the numbers of accredited laboratories worldwide. We have only 30 accredited laboratories and only one in Africa. Better education projects, hear the voice of athletes. I'm a former athlete, that's why I fully understand this, the necessity that we need to hear the voice of athletes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, ministers, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Alan Abrahamson. I'm a sports writer from Los Angeles. I'd like to thank the University of Southern California, where I teach, for allowing me time off here to do this week. I'd also like to thank the organizers here for having us, and I'd also especially like to thank the organizers for this setup. It looks remarkably like a therapist's office in Beverly Hills. So we're going to have a little group therapy here for the next hour, if we may. The ground rules are this is sort of a conversation. It's not an interrogation and it's not an interview. Everyone is free to interrupt anybody else. And what I'd like to do is start with Sir Craig, and this being California style, we're going to go first name basis. Craig, when you took over in 2014, you had some significant experience in the realm of anti-doping. What did you think you knew, and what did you quickly learn? And now, as your days are coming to an end, what did you think you really knew back in 2014?
If we go back, that time, we knew that we wanted to be a hybrid organization between sport and governments, but we actually weren't quite sure how we were going to deliver that. We started with 2 government officials as our first 2 employees in 4 rooms in the Avenue Tribunal office in Lausanne. We only needed 2 rooms, so we sublet the other 2 just to save some money. And as we began to work things out, we were conscious of the fact that our organization was funded entirely by the IOC for the first 2 years. So how, in fact, was government going to come on board? But the prime interest from the sports movement, and certainly I think the prime interest across the board, was how we began to harmonize rules. So the first exercise really was to get to a situation whereby everybody could play to the same rules and on the same playing field. You know, looking back now, you know, here we are 20 years later, we've got 700 code signatories. We've got a staff of 139 in Montreal and offices all around the world. And the whole range of activity is probably beyond anything we conceived as early as that. It took the sports movement some time to work out how they could involve government fully in the organization. Contributions, for example. Everything was going to be 50-50. It takes a long time for these things to develop. But actually, looking at where we are now, I don't think any of us at that stage thought we would get to where we are. Maybe we didn't have quite as much breadth of thinking as we thought.
Craig, the IOC president said in his remarks this morning that there has been significant progress. Does it feel that way to you? He said there has been significant progress. Does it feel that way?
Well, for the last, for 50% of our existence, significant progress has been headlong. We have been asked to do more and more each year. It became more complicated each year. We took over the accreditation of laboratories from the Olympic movement. Each year, science changed, science improved. I wouldn't say we've been fighting a rearguard action, but we've certainly been running quite quickly to keep up with the developments. And then, unfortunately, we ran into a bad spell when we were faced with issues which I don't think any of us ever believed we would have been faced with, and we hope we'll never be faced with them again.
One more question, if I may, before I switch to Witold. When this is all over, will you have any regrets? Will you have any regrets? When December 31st comes, will you have any regrets?
Yes, constantly, because almost on a month-by-month basis, you sat and looked at what you had achieved. You thought what could be achieved a little more. If I have a regret, it is that we probably spent too long making sure that everybody became rule compliant, because one set of rules was the first and important priority, as opposed to where we are now, where more and more we are operationally compliant. The system is better now. If you have 700 code signatories, if everybody is prepared to look at how they deliver the services and make it better, then in my view, it's a shame that we spent a little too long on the rules and not quite long enough on actually delivering the good services.
Just so everyone can understand, it's easy for you to hear us out there. It's hard for us to hear us up here. Witold, switching to you. Thank you for your speech earlier today. I'd like to build on that, if I may, and expound a little bit. In your opinion, as you look to take over this organization, what do you see, the obvious question, as the biggest challenge or biggest challenges going forward?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me please accept the assurance of my highest consideration to all the panelists. I'm really honored that I'm sitting here together with you and we can discuss about the principles, the values and the future of our World Anti-Doping Agency. I respect your knowledge, your experience, and I will draw on your heritage. I think that this is absolutely necessary to move forward some issues, but we have a lot of challenges before us. First of all, the future of Anti-Doping Agency, one of the biggest priorities is maintaining the unity of WADA by working closely with all stakeholders, to build a bridge between all stakeholders. And what does it mean, all stakeholders? Not only public authorities and sports movement, but also with NADOS, with athletes particularly, and even journalists, because we have the same objective: eradicate the doping in sport. I mentioned during my speech that one of the biggest problem of anti-doping policy, it's not considerable budget. Dopers, cheats are so innovative, unfortunately, and we need to be as innovative as possible to catch them and throw out from the sport. And the sentence which I underlined, that this is ridiculous that the biggest regulator of anti-doping policy has only less than $40 million budget. It's true, this is my approach. That's why I proposed, for instance, establishing anti-doping solidarity fund. Maybe I will have some opportunity to say something more about it later, about the idea of this proposition. But the second case is to eliminate anti-doping blank spots, anti-doping gaps. We have still some countries in the world without national anti-doping organizations, so we need to focus our attention on building capacity at the national level. Of course, we have RADOS, but even the most effective RADO cannot replace the NADO. That's why it's absolutely very important to create strong partnership between less well-developed countries and less developed countries to help those who is less developed, establishing national anti-doping organizations to help them conduct activities. And well, what else? Better communication, particularly with the athletes, and engage them also to including the decision-making process. I promise that during my term of office I will organize some consultations. I will share with the athletes our views, our proposals, because WADA was created for the athletes.
Let's talk money for a second. You mentioned in your speech that no global institution of this sort can be run effectively on a budget of $40 million USD. I've written this many, many times. Okay, you take over as president January 1st. What's your magic solution?
Well, I'm coming back to the idea of anti-doping solidarity fund. I'm not the Christopher Columbus of anti-doping policy. It's not new idea to to engage, for instance, the big sponsor of sport to create anti-doping policy as their part of their corporate social responsibility. And it will be one of the biggest tasks ahead me to convince the big sponsors, the big companies to join to the fund, to the idea of anti-doping solidarity fund. It's difficult to convince, for instance, I know it because I'm the minister, to governments to increase so high the contribution. That's why we need to find some alternative additional solutions how we can increase the budget for anti-doping policy. That's why one of the ideas is to anti-doping solidarity fund, to convince the biggest partners that if you are the sponsor of sport, you want to be the sponsor of clean sport.
Let me press you on this for just a second, though. It's obvious, and I like to be very obvious in my journalism and in my questions. Since the scandal has erupted, not one government has stepped up significantly in the manner you're describing. Why do you think that they should step forward now in 2020 to do exactly what you're asking? Sure. Since the scandal has erupted, not one government, not one, has stepped up in a significant way. You're proposing that they should. How are you going to get them to do such a thing?
Well, I think that now after the reforms, WADA is better equipped than before, and we need to be tough in our decisions, in our policies. And it's for me, it's absolutely obvious that we have some tools to be effective in this area, of course.
So, turning to a different subject, you're the sports minister of your country. What has been your experience in working with WADA? The ups, the downs, the in-betweens?
It's a good question, because when I started to be minister, my beginning first cooperation with WADA was difficult for Poland, for us, because WADA confirmed that you need to change your law, because our law in Poland wasn't adapted to the rules of WADA, and we got 3 months to improve this situation. If not, you will be non-compliant. It was before Rio Olympic Games, and imagine the difficulties of this situation for the current minister. But we did it. It was a huge cooperation between all political parties in the parliament to change first the current law, and we of course also prepared the new law according to the anti-doping policy, and we established POLADA, Polish Anti-Doping Agency, with strong new tools for this organization, for this agency. We increased the budget 4 times. That's why it was one of the reasons. That's why my colleagues minister, they trust me. But now, looking for the past from my now perspective, I think that this move from WADA was very good for us, for Poland. I wasn't satisfied in 2016, but now thanks this approach, WADA's approach to my country, we totally improved the situation, and we have in completely different place now, and I think that our anti-doping policy in Poland is really strong now.
Okay, one more, if I may, for you. In your description, what is the template? What should cooperation between governments and WADA look like? What should that template look like?
For the perspective?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's challenging. As I mentioned, the Polish example, I think, is a good example for the future. My own example of our country, this approach to Poland should be similar to other countries. WADA's new approach and sometimes the tough statement, tough position. It's good. It's reasonable, and I think sometimes it's good to prepare major reforms.
Moving back to you, Mr. Pound. There you are. The president of Poland spoke about the magic and mystery of time in his remarks. So to go back to one of my favorite musicians, David Byrne, I might ask, how did we get here? You were there at the beginning, if you wouldn't mind taking us back. We just heard from Vitold about what his plans are starting January 1. Take us back to 1999.
Well, it was a very exciting time because we were trying to do something that had never been done before. We'd put together with a lot of help the concept of the agency, got it organized and created by November of 1999, and then started. And my first thing was, well, let's get in the field as early as we possibly can and start testing athletes before the Sydney Games in 2000. Good start. Except my education started there. When we started to think about doing the testing, we found that more than half of the Olympic summer international federations did not even have rules that allowed them to test out of competition. So I said, oh boy, all the stuff I've been hearing about, doping controls are under control and we're in good shape was just wrong. And then we had to help the federations get some rules in place, did some largely ineffective testing, I think, in the rest of the year. And then we started to address the hodgepodge of conflicting rules, no rules, sophisticated rules. It was a complete mess, and it was clear that we had to find some way to get everybody on the same page. So we started a consultation process that took us the best part of 3 years to get people used to the idea of a code, to expand the consultations outside of the sports that had developed anti-doping programs, to involve governments in it, to see what it was going to look like. And by the time we got to 2003, we thought we were ready. So the second World Conference on Sport in Copenhagen was in March. We walked everybody at a conference like this, but much smaller in those days, through the code article by article. That was a process handled by, or chaired by Richard Young, and did a wonderful job. And at the end of the conference, we were in a position to say, are we in favor of adopting this code? And those of you who are experienced international conferencers will know that the voting often takes place by applause. And I knew there were some soft spots in all of this, and I thought, oh dear, I don't want somebody to say, well, I didn't applaud on behalf of my sport or my country. So I put both my hands behind my back and I looked out at the suspicious ones and I said, is there anybody in this room that does not agree we should go ahead with the code? Waiting is a very offensive weapon, as you know. And finally, after about 30 seconds, we said, okay, then it's unanimous. The WADA Foundation Board retired to a conference room, took a 5-minute meeting to adopt the code, then we came back and said, all right, now we have a code. What do we do with it? Because the mere fact that WADA had a code meant nothing. We had to get all of the parties, international federations, the IOC, the National Olympic Committees, to incorporate that in their own internal rules. And that was a process, it was certainly led by the IOC, which walked the extra mile in saying, by the way, the implementation date we'd set it on was before the opening ceremonies of the Athens Games. If you have not done this by then, don't bother coming to Athens. And so the Olympic movement got its act together for then. The governments were more problematic. They couldn't simply adopt a code adopted by a private institution, even though they were 50% of the governing power. But they said, we'll find a way, but we're not going to make it by Athens. And to their credit, by November of 2005, the Conference of Parties adopted unanimously at the time the code as the basis for the fight against doping in sport under the UNESCO Charter. And so we, for the first time in history, had everybody on the same page, the public sector and the sports sector.
You've written an op-ed in the Globe and Mail in Toronto in the last couple of days that details a lot of the steps along this journey. From your perspective, 20 years is both a long time, but also the blink of an eye. Where do you think this institution, this organization is compared to 1999?
Oh, it's light years ahead of where we were then. I mean, all we had was a few general ideas, and we were very good about...
Let me interrupt. Do you think the general public perception is that the state of the clean sport movement is light years ahead of where it was 20 years ago?
I think you'd have to be a little homeboyish to reach that conclusion, but certainly more people know about the problem and know that efforts are being undertaken to try and deal with it, which they didn't know at the time. And nobody realized that doping in sport was such a problem. When we spoke to the governments about, drugs, they said, oh yes, we understand drugs. Marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. And we said, no. What about anabolic steroids and insulin-based hormones and EPO and things like that? They'd never heard of them. And so they didn't have the mental process to go through with a completely different set of drugs. And so that was an educational process that they picked up on very quickly. And as I say, they got this code negotiated and adopted in record time for a UN organization.
And do you think that and the right word, the fact that so many countries had such significant buy-in in such short time gets the recognition it deserves? I mean, truly, it's an amazing thing. More than 200 countries or that many.
I think you're right. It was remarkable. There was a tide. It became interesting or challenging or proper social responsibility to take all this seriously, which had never been done before.
Why do you think that is, really?
I think within the Olympic context, you notice that in the professional sports, the entertainment sports, people don't care what the athletes do to prepare. They're there to see what's on television on Sunday afternoon or whatever it may be, and what they do to themselves to get there doesn't much matter. And if they're cheating, it doesn't much matter. But if somebody's cheated at the Olympic Games, that resonates much more with people, and they don't want that to happen. The Olympic Games are so aspirational. You think, if we can get this right, maybe the world can get more things right. And so when something interferes with that, there's a disproportionate reaction against that kind of conduct.
John, with that, I'd like to switch over to you. Picking up from what Dick said, if you had to write an op-ed right now, what would your op-ed say?
Look, I acknowledge, first of all, that enormous progress has been made, and listening to that being recounted by Craig and Dick this morning reminds us all of that. These days, 6 years after my term finished, I'm clearly an observer, not a daily practitioner. I sit in the grandstand, and my observations tell me that the fight for clean athletes is not necessarily in the best place it could be at this point in time. That stems from the systemic doping in Russia, the fact that notwithstanding sanctions that were imposed, some 282 athletes of Russia competed in Rio, and 169 athletes of Russia competed in South Korea in 2018. Now, is that an effective sanction when you see systemic doping? The situation then unfolded to a point where the Russian Anti-Doping Organisation was allowed back in before what was demanded was handed over. And then a small extension of time was given when the deadline wasn't met. Now, I know that there is a really big effort being made to bring this to a conclusion, but until such time as it is, I can well understand why athletes and sports fans have got concerns. One thing to say, there may be a level of distrust or disquiet. What would I do that might help? Firstly, I would say that it is in the interests of the fight for clean athletes to have a truly independent foundation board and executive committee. Of course, it should be represented by governments of the world, by athletes, by sport, but the majority should be independent. I found it difficult to see that there were pre-meetings for sport, pre-meetings for government, there was meetings in Europe, and that people came into the room to make a decision based on collective wisdom on behalf of clean athletes with a little piece of paper that said, this is where we stand, before a word was spoken by anybody. So I'd like to see independence. I suspect it will be difficult for it to occur, but I'd like to see it. Secondly, I support the words of IOC President this morning in saying that we need legislation. My memory is that 6 years ago when my term finished, there was Italy, there was Australia, there was France, there was possibly Germany, I can't recall. Very few countries that had the capacity of legislation to enable law enforcement agencies to use those powers that law enforcement agency had, seizure, subpoenas, those sort of things. That to me ultimately leads to giving power to the fight against cheats. And thirdly, I would say we need to expand the education, and again I support the initiatives announced this morning. It seems to me that despite the sport, by and large, there's still a level of ignorance there, and I can tell you it is in my country, in some of our most popular sports. I get annoyed when I see they sign contracts for billions of dollars for television rights and will tell you that on an annual basis they spend only $1 million or $2 million on detecting cheats. Wow, what is reputation worth? It is worth an enormous amount of money from governments, and that education can flow from governments if governments are willing to ensure that that might happen. And my last point is to say that greater respect has to be given to the views of athletes. Our workplaces have democratised. Workers have rights, safety at work, discrimination. There are laws about that. There is a feeling that athletes can be penalised harshly, and I don't think our penalties are too harsh under our code, but that frequently there is no sanction against administrators. In the corporate world, company directors, if they breach, they can go to jail, etc. They can be fined, they can be suspended for years from being a company director. So I think there has to be some level of equality for sports administrators, and we need that to be abundantly clear, despite the fact that they might, in most cases, only be volunteers.
Please write that op-ed. Menashe, John just talked about education, among other things. So among the other reasons that you're up here with us is your experience as a young athlete, having been a part of this sort of education. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, everybody here and everybody out there, and then we'll go from there, okay?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm Monashe. I come from Zimbabwe, Africa. And how I started knowing about the World Anti-Doping Agency was through me going to the Africa Youth Games, where we were qualifying to go to the Youth Olympic Games that were in Argentina. So in Algeria, that's where the Africa Youth Games were. I would go to the water booths and just, play the games that were there because I enjoy playing games. So I would go there, and then at the same time, I was also learning about what WADA was all about, like knowing about how, as athletes, we should play fair and we should be ethical in how we play, that we don't need like the use of substances to perform. So yeah, that's what I learned in Algeria. And then at the Youth Olympic Games, because I was just excited to go back to the water booths because of the prizes that would come, I explored more because I was triggered by this need to then know what the World Anti-Doping Agency was all about. And from the education that I was getting from the booth, I learned like a whole lot of information. And for me as an athlete, I feel safe knowing that that's what they're trying to do for us as athletes, to protect us from all these things that could deter our health, and also that we play at a level playing field.
So just to back up just a sec, you're how old now?
I'm 19.
And you finished what part of school?
I finished high school last year, yes.
And you'll start college or university when?
Hopefully next year. I'm planning to get a hockey scholarship in America, so I've been applying to the different schools that are there. So.
We will be glad to have you. So, to be clear, you knew nothing or almost next to nothing about the World Anti-Doping Agency or the anti-doping rules before this experience, is that correct?
Yeah, that's true.
And your encounter was that you were incentivized by the possibility of winning prizes when you encountered at the youth games, right?
Yes.
Can you describe just a little bit more, because this is the way this works in practice often. Describe the booth and what the booth was like and what you were learning there, please.
Okay, as a young person, we are intrigued by an incentive, like what you're saying. So I would go into the booth. It was very exciting to be in because people were at the different stations playing the different games and coming out smiling with the different prizes that they'll be getting. Then at the same time, after that, we discuss what we would have learned. It was just a few athletes that were talking about it.
This is with your field hockey team, yes?
Yes, with my team. We then discuss about the whole anti-doping process, and we'll be thinking, oh, what if it would be my turn? So now with the information that we're getting, we would know what would come. So we would then try and tell the other athletes back home, like what I tried to do at my high school, just to tell people that there's an organization that's helping athletes to perform without the need for substances. So yeah, at the booths, I felt enlightened by this, and I brought it back to my home country in Zimbabwe.
So just to build on that a little bit, it's been a year now, more or less, since Buenos Aires. When you've gone home and you've told people that there's a thing called WADA, and they have these rules, how have you explained that, and what have you told people?
Well, I'd explain it in simpler terms so they could understand. Everyone, at my high school, people know all about steroids and everything. So, especially the boys, because they're the ones who are talking about it half the time. So I would then tell them that you guys know that you can affect your health by doing that. And then I would then tell them the different doping stages that they would have to then go through during the processes if they were ever selected. So they ended up saying, oh, wow, thank you so much. I don't think it's the right thing that we're doing. So they then felt that I told them something that could actually help them in their sport career and also in their health. So that's how I then implemented that to most of the guys at school, yeah.
So one final question, and then did you ever think growing up that these rules would affect you personally?
Sorry?
Did you ever think growing up that these rules would affect you?
I don't think, I'm not understanding.
Did you think growing up that these rules that we're talking about, that are the subject of this whole conference, would affect you?
Well, I didn't really think about it until I started learning about it. So, like what my dad, before I came here, what he was telling me was that, because I work at a primary school, he was saying that with the kids that you like hang around with, you should try and help them understand the ethical rules about sport at a very young age so that they can grow up knowing that if they do this, they'll get into so much trouble. If they do this, they're destroying their health. So I wish I had learned about this when I was younger. But now with my knowledge, I hopefully can tell the future generation that's coming what WADA is all about and what it fights for the sport. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That's perfect. Thanks. Linda, I'm going to switch over to you if I might. Why is it, do you think, and you've heard Menashe's comments, which were so eloquent and beautiful, you know, in every country in the world, governments are responsible for education, among other things. Why do you think governments aren't stronger in the context of anti-doping, not just education, just why is it that governments are not stronger in the context of anti-doping worldwide and within WADA? Why?
It's difficult to answer that question, but I think it's important for all the governments of the world to commit in a whole other way than we can see they're doing now. And when I was elected as the vice president of WADA, when I come into the board, I saw that there was an imbalance between governments and the sports movement. So the first thing I did was to take the initiative, the One Voice initiative, and it's great to hear President Bach today praising One Voice. I think I still have the napkin where I wrote the first paragraphs on. So hopefully with Minister Banka as the president, we will now see stronger governments in the way forward. I think that's necessary. I think also it's necessary to implement key principles like good governance in a whole other way than we can see today. Because coming from governments, I can see the need for sports organizations to implement independence, transparency, gender equality, democracy in a whole other way than we can see today.
Do you think those things have been missing or in short supply? Have you observed those things? Good governance has been missing, do you think?
Yes.
Yes.
Coming from governments is easy to see the big difference between sports movements and how there is a need for working on implementing principles of good governance. And of course, you know, we have had tough times. We have been through tough times the last years. There has been difficult times, and I think we have a possibility now to handle the current Russian case. If we handle that appropriately, this is opportunity to re-establish accountability. Because you heard from the athletes the last years that you know they they want to see a strong and independent WADA standing up for them. And within WADA, we have had different opinions, and I think that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because if there is an organization that embrace different views, I think also that organization can be stronger. And I hope for more discussions within WADA, between sports movement and athletes and governments in the years to come.
So I'll ask you the same question I asked Vitold. What is going to take to get governments to step up, especially financially?
I would like to see more commitment from all governments, and I think there is a big responsibility for all the sports ministers, but also engagement in a whole other way than we can see today. But that's also important for governments to know that they can count on an organization like WADA, that the money they spent, the taxpayers' money they spent and used to fund WADA, really will give result. And you know, the last years that we are leaving behind us now, questions are asked. And that's why I think it's very important that also we can see that different nations and countries now are or want to strengthen their legislation. Like we can see the US are doing with the Rodchenko Act, what we see the German and the Austrian have done, what we see in Norway now, that the parliament want to strengthen their national legislation so we are stronger and more efficient in handling doping cases, and they give the necessary tools for the police and the agencies to fight
You've
doping.
been in a unique position these last few years. Why do you think it is that no government has stepped up, especially financially, come forward with any significant sums? This story has been in every newspaper and on every TV screen for the last 3 or 4 years. You've been in a unique position to assess government responsibility, and yet no government has come forward.
I think they have been asking themselves if they can, if they believe that we are working on this and handling the doping crisis in the most efficient way. So I think they are, you know, following it very closely. And I think the only answer is a strong and independent WADA. But we need to prove that WADA is the answer in the way forward, and a strong and independent WADA is the most efficient way of fighting doping.
Jan, switching to you. All set?
Yeah.
So being back in Poland brings back certain special memories for you. Should we start there?
Yeah, before I start, I would like to say it's very awful to be the last person before lunch. So I will try make sure my speech not too long. Poland is a very special place for me. 20 years ago, about her age, I was ISU athlete representative to participate very first international meeting, council meeting. At that time, I speak zero English, and I was nervous, very, very nervous. I remember during the break, I went to my president, Mr. Chen Kwangda. I asked him, I said, what am I gonna do? What should I do? And he told me, he says, you tell me, that's your sports. And that was open my mind. And then the first time I start thinking, it is my sports. I have responsibility to make it better. And I remember after I go back home, the first thing I did, I read a letter on the wall. It says, athlete area, that was on the venue wall. Athlete area, no smoking. So I learned something, and all the way from 20 years ago. And it's very nice sitting next to her, because that's remind me when the age like her, who I was. So, good memory.
It's a special treat for me to be here today with you too, because I had the privilege of working with Apollo Ono in writing his book. So I remember watching you skate in Salt Lake City and in Torino as well. Take us now through the journey that's seen you go from being a championship athlete to now becoming the vice president of this organization. How does that happen?
Before I started the introduction, I should say I would like to thank the people who are around here. I mean, especially sitting here, like our entrepreneur who started the foundation. I think the father of the WADA, and Craig and John, because those people who believe the athlete and who trust the athlete, who are supporting athlete, that's how I think that's the one of the biggest reason why I started from an athlete and all the way to here. And Thomas Bach, president, just left, and who is also very much in belief with the athletes, and also because of the passion you have for the sports. And I grew up in the sports. You understand the sports is not only about winning and lose. It's also help you to be a better person, and which is very, very important, not only for myself and for many people. Now I'm 2 kids of a mother, and I know it's very important for the young kids to have the right environment for sports. So that's something we always believe, and that's also helping me to push you go forward. Yeah.
Looking forward, how do you see these next few years? Yeah. And also, there's a tremendous symbolism in the fact that the two of you, Witold and you, are athletes. And I think there's an important symbolism also in the fact that you are not a Western athlete and that you are in this important position of leadership. So there's a lot in this question. How do you see these next few years going forward, you?
At first, at beginning, I was quite nervous because I know it's very, very challenged, and also it's huge responsibility. But also I was very excited because I know at this important period or moment, and I have the opportunity to really make changes. And together with Mr. Banka and everybody sitting here, it's my second EXCO meeting last 2 days. I'm still learning, but I feel like it's not scary as I thought, because there are so many things is already in my blood, and so many things is already in my experience. For example, what I can see for the future, something for me is very passionate about the athlete experience. And through all the process of the anti-doping, for example, the education, we have to put athlete experience on the top, on the first. And we have to understand how athlete can learn such important information. And of course, I have to make sure the things on the ground and work together with IFs, NADOs, NOCs, and all the stakeholders, make sure athletes got the information and got the support. For example, like I have a very strong, I was very excited or very strong beliefs with what Thomas Bach this morning said about the entourage, and which is, we all agree it's important issue we have to work with. And the entourage, we need to find a way to educate them as well, because to support athletes, they need skill as well. They need education. So how can we support them to support athletes? Also, the other way, we also need a sanction because there's bad people we're never going to change. And on top of that, there's also some athlete may need the legal ads, and especially with doping case, and we need to give a support. And on top of that, also a whistleblower program, speak up program, and come from east side of the world, and I know the culture, how effect on this kind of program. So we have to encourage the athlete, educate the athlete, make sure athletes feel comfortable and safe to speak up, to help us to fight against doping. So there's many things in my mind, and I'm still learning, but I'm very confident because I can see people here really supporting us, and I can see the WADA professional staffs. They're really doing a good job in the last 20 years, leading by those leaders. And I'm have confidence and excited together with Mr. Banka, and who has 3 kids. I have 2 kids. We have to work together for our future because they are the hopes. We cannot let the cheaters and dopers to break our hopes. Yeah, thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, with great affection for all of the dignitaries who came before us, we were given an hour, and that's an hour and 1 minute. So my journalism professors at Northwestern said, meet our deadline. We have met our deadline. I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you, one and all. It's been a great pleasure. You get another hour of me with session 3. Thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you.